So welcome to this study, and it's been a while since we've been able to offer a Bible study here at Christ Lutheran. So I'm both glad to be able to do that and glad to be at this stage in my thesis work. What is required by the program is that you do a time of instruction in your context. So for some people who were in the program, they taught at Christian colleges or things like that. So their context would be their students. So for example, one of the other people in Saskatchewan who has this degree, who's got it already, teaches at Briarcrest. And so his project involved instruction with his students, but that was pretty simple because it's all set up. You have students anyways, right? So in my case, and in the case of many, the instruction time is offered to their congregation, right? And so that's what we're doing with this. So there's the time of instruction, but the research component is that survey that a number of you filled out already. And what will happen is that it's called a pre and post study survey. So you've done an initial filling out of the survey, and then when the class is all finished after all 5 weeks, there's going to be a second survey, and then that allows me to sort of see if there's been any change or shift in understanding or thinking or whatever. Okay, so that's the sort of the research component. Another aspect of the research component will be after the study is all done. Then I will form a couple of focus groups. One will be based on sort of the people who generally attended the Wednesday ones. And then one will be for the Thursday night group. That's that. And then there's still even more because I will do some one-on-one interviews with a few select individuals. And then I gather all that data from these conversations and whatnot. And then I try and make sense of it and write that up. And when I get that written up, that's called chapter 4 in the thesis. And then all that remains after that is a summary chapter 5, where I tie everything together. Now, what this study is this is essentially an overview of chapter 2. So this is the foundational material. So you start with a golden thread, they called it, or a general basic concept, biblical concept, and then you built on that with biblical foundations, historical foundations, theological foundations, sociological foundations as well. So what we're doing in these next weeks is we're going through these different parts of my chapter 2 in a way that hopefully will help you understand a little deeper what I'm trying to express in this study. And the golden thread, and you see it right in the title of the study, is faith is formed in community. I could use brackets around the word primarily. So I could say faith is primarily formed in community. But this is an important aspect because we live in a day and age that, unlike any other in history, is highly individualized. And so we think of things and we function in a way that's highly individualistic. And we see things in an individualized way first, and then maybe community second. Whereas ancient peoples, well, not even that ancient, you only have to really go back about a century. And the sense was the community, and then my place in the community. But you started with the communities, in a sense. And so this is an attempt to kind of reclaim some of that understanding in terms of how it relates to our faith life. So that's my basic golden thread. Faith is formed in community. So what we're going to look at in these next 5 weeks is we're going to look at these different foundations, starting today with biblical foundations. And I just find how these things seem to work in life. Just, I don't know, like you've heard the expression, there's no such thing as a coincidence, right? Well, why was it that on Sunday, okay, the Old Testament reading is the very reading that I base my part of my biblical foundation. So that's anyways. So it's a good introduction. In fact, if you heard my sermon on Sunday, you got just like a little brief introduction to what this is all about. All right. Well, we have 14 people online. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 in the room here. So that's great. Let's begin with the prayer, and then we're going to do a general get to know you kind of exercise. So let's start with the prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for bringing us together, whether we're online or we're here in the classroom. We ask that your Spirit would be present with us as we listen, as we think, as we discuss what it means for faith to be formed in community. I thank you for each of the people who are participating in this study, and ask that you would bless our time together. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my PowerPoint screen. So what we're going to do is start with, well, I've already done this sort of little introduction, but what I really want to get to is the participant introductions. And we're going to try and do this as efficiently as possible. And what I'm going to do, we're going to start in the room. And those of you online, unfortunately, I'm not going to kind of turn the camera around. You just have to listen. But I'm going to get everyone to say their name and then your first memory of worship. So it could be a place. So you might think of a church. It could be people, a particular person. It could be a pastor maybe, or maybe a Sunday school teacher or something like that. Or something that happened. Like you might think of an event. Oh, it was like, I remember taking communion or seeing communion or whatever, right? Now, this isn't a test that if I find out later that you actually had another memory that was earlier, you're going to be in trouble. We're not going to do it that way. But this is just a way of introducing ourselves. So we're going to start in the room, and then we're going to go to the people online. And I'm just going to have to indicate, how am I going to do that? Well, I'll figure that out. All right. So we're going to start in the room. We're going to start over here with Ray. Now, these speaker phones, this is a new thing we've been using in council, and it seems to work fairly well for the people online to hear us and for us to hear them. So hopefully this works. But I'd invite you to, not be timid in your introduction. So, have I given you enough time to think about your first memory of worship there, Ray?
Yes.
All right. So who are you? And
yeah, my name is Ray McCruel, and it is a memory that goes back, and it's always very clear to me. I attended a small church in Killallie, Saskatchewan, which no longer exists, this church. And what I remember most was going to this church, which was lined with chairs, and this minister being what today would term fire and brimstone. I'll never forget him yelling from the pulpit.
okay, not necessarily positive memory, unless you like yellers. But
Well, I liked it there.
Oh, then, okay.
I liked it. I went to vacation Bible school.
Okay, thanks, Ray.
My name's Janice Witham. So I believe my first memory was a Christmas concert at church when I was very young. I just remember the cold winter night, the warm church, the people, the music, the lights. That would be, I think, going back as early as I could.
Okay, thanks, Janice.
My name is Ann Nussbacken. My first memory is My first clear memory is the day I was confirmed. It was in Augustana, Lutheran Church in Saskatoon, and it was a brand new church. And so we were the first confirmation group to be confirmed in that church. And prior to that, everything is fuzzy, but that was my first clear memory of worship.
Okay, well, in Augustana, my friend, David Hunter was pastor there for a number of years. And, so you were the first confirmation class there?
Yeah.
Oh, that's pretty cool. Thanks.
I'm Mary Burr, and my first memory for my background's Ukrainian was the Ukrainian church on Macara Street. And just remember all the people milling in the icon, the mom wearing a hat, and auntie and uncle were there, and everything was in Greek or Ukrainian. So I didn't understand a lot of what was going on, but it was people moving around, especially kissing the icons.
Okay, thanks, Mary.
Mine is ancient.
Well,
My first memory is in
first of all, who are you?
Oleona Hagel
There we go.
from
Thanks.
Trinity. I'm going to probably join this church. Yeah. Manitoba Dauphin. And we lived on a farm, and I remember my relatives meeting in living rooms, in houses. And I think about this every once in a while, that there was this little room and a few people and a minister from Winnipeg. That's I think about it quite often. That's my first memory.
So house churches,
Before I went to school,
okay,
way before I went to school. I think maybe I was 3 or 4 or something.
thanks, Leona.
My name is Angela Eddy, and my first memory of church was in Griffin, Saskatchewan. It's a small little church, small little town. And we always went to church. So I remember being in church way before I was 5. And all my cousins lived in that area. And so after church, we would all play, and we had so much fun. My grandparents lived in town, my aunt lived in town. So it was like not just going to church, it was an all day thing.
Yeah. Thanks, Angela.
Mary Ann McDonald. I can remember back to a couple things even when I was 2, Mom and Dad taking me and holding me, and it was Knox Presbyterian Church in Weymouth, and they have beautiful stained glass, and pictures mean everything to kids, and made me feel warm. But my real memory was when I was 3, a letter came from the church, and then a phone call that I would be inducted on such and such a Sunday into the cradle roll. And what they please bring me. And it was a big deal. And you're all dressed up and everything, and you receive a beautiful certificate. And in the background is the picture of Jesus and the children. And then in calligraphy is your name, like you got a degree, And there it was, and the superintendent called you up, and my sister had to take me. And you kind of froze. And it was and they gave a blessing. And it was just really beautiful. As an adult, you would probably call it a conversion, kind of. But yeah, I can see it like right in front of me now. And I was only 3 months. You're right, community. And then everybody raised their hands, and all the older kids and everything as a blessing. Yeah. Anyway, that's.
Thanks, Marion. Thanks.
My name is Craig Weinbender. My first earliest memory was country church with the Zion flowing well. All the men sat on one side, the women on the other side. All the women had to have hats on,
Yes.
and all the women wore dresses.
Yeah, different day and age now, eh? There's I have a record album, the title of the album is When All the Men Wore Hats. Cause that was, I remember that, you know, everyone, but they had the hat rack, you know. But we didn't sit on separate sides like your church did. But thanks, Craig.
My name is Alexis Lightby Cuthbert, and when I was 3 years old, we moved back to Saskatchewan. And my parents then went on a trek of finding the right church. They started out in the country and then they moved, we were at Good Shepherd and St. Paul, and then we finally got here when I was about 10. But before we got here, I remember at St. Paul, no, at Good Shepherd, that when you were a child in Sunday school, you would walk to the front through all the people and all the kids and get a pencil because it was your birthday that week. Okay, so I think I was 5 and I was excited about getting my pencil that week coming up. And the day before, which was actually my birthday, my brother, who was 10, took me on a bike ride and my foot got caught in the wheel spokes. And so I couldn't walk, I was limping and everything. So I was devastated because I wasn't going to be able to walk up the next day and get my pencil. So my sister, who was 12, carried me up so I could get my pencil. So that's my.
Well, you know, little things mean big things with the little people, right?
There you go.
Thanks, Alexis. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Will Futz. Yeah, my first memory, the clear one, was my grandfather's funeral. Actually, I was 6 years old. And both my grandfathers and an uncle died within 1 year, a real short time. He was Ukrainian Orthodox, so probably that same church on Carrier Street I went to at the time. But anyway, he was the priest was talking about death, and you don't be scared of it. And it's like he was talking right to me, and that was my first moment, I guess. But yeah, he was saying that death is just like you're going to sleep and you're gonna wake up again, so it's, you know, don't get too scared of that. But so that was a pretty clear one. I remember it well. It's only a little gaffer. That was way too.
Thanks, Will.
Hi, I'm Deborah Weirs. And I think one of my first memories was going to Sunday school at St. Mark's Lutheran Church in Markinch, Saskatchewan. And I don't remember a lot of what was being taught, but I do remember that one of my Sunday school teachers, I remembered him well, and I remembered his name. He really made me feel welcome, and probably I learned the most from him, and it was just a good feeling. And then going to Vacation Bible School out in Markinch as well, just a real sense of community. You know, it was just fun. You know, you spent the entire day there. You know, we even had to bring lunches. It was fun. Really good.
Thanks, Deborah.
Well, my name is Ann Moore, and I grew up in Southern Illinois in the US. And we went to a Methodist church, and my earliest memory is, first of all, going to choir practice. And I think I was about 5, and there was a children's choir. And the next, we met on Saturday morning, and the next day we were singing in church. And so we just paraded up into the front of the sanctuary and sang a song, and nobody clapped because we didn't do that. But that's what I remember. I don't remember anything else other than going back and sitting down because Sunday school was the next hour. So it was church.
Thanks, Ann. Now, those of you online, could you hear all the introductions okay? Well, then these things are working. That's great. All right, so now how we're gonna do this is, we're gonna go according to the order on my screen, though I'll go last. So I'm gonna go, right to left. So Brenda, you're gonna be the first one to introduce yourself and give your, memory.
Okay. Hi. My name is Brenda Craddock. I have two memories, and they're both when I was about 3 or 4. The one that overrides the other one is being in the little white church in the basement, in the kitchen, in the nursery class. And my aunt was teaching using a flannel board. And we were crowded in there. There were so many of us little guys. And I remember her holding this board on the counter and putting shepherds up there and sheep, and they were sticking in it. This was just magical to me. And then my next memory is also in the little white church, being in church upstairs with mom and dad and trying to hide from the minister because I thought he was talking directly to me because we were up front. And I thought was yelling, but he was talking in a loud voice. And I was trying to get under my dad's arm to hide. That's it.
Thanks, Brenda. And the little white church you're referring to is actually the first version of Christ Lutheran.
Yes.
And it's actually, the location of it is where we are now in the fellowship hall. So this layout is basically the layout of the original white church.
Is that the one in the valley?
It has now been moved out to
Shepherd.
Shepherd of the Hills in Lumsden. So the original Christ Lutheran Church is still in use. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Brenda. Paul, you're next. Oh, but you need to unmute here. Yeah. Oh, I can't hear you for some reason, Paul. No, I can't hear you either, Val. So I'm not sure why. So now it says it's muted. Now it says it's unmuted. No. Oh, hold it. I think I heard something there, Val. No. I heard you guys earlier because you were talking and I heard you. Well, technology. You can fiddle with that. We'll come back to you and see if we can get it figured out afterwards. Okay. So we're going to jump to you, Rose. Rose Stats. Yep.
Hi, my name is Rose Stats, and I also had two memories. One was a Christmas concert, and I couldn't have been much more than 4, but I still remember my lines, and it was, "I'm so happy I could say Jesus Christ was born today." And I would look so forward to going to church, like for the Christmas concert, but just going to church on Christmas Eve was always just really, really special because we would we would all get these brown paper bags with peanuts and a Christmas orange and a candy cane. And I don't remember, there was a few other things in there, but that was Christmas at our house. We didn't get Christmas gifts. So that was a huge deal to go. And the other one is, I mean, I've had lots of really positive ones, but Pastor Fredrickson and Nona, I remember being invited to their house. I couldn't have been much more than 8. And we didn't have fancy teacups or fancy anything. And Nona invited us in and we had tea. And she actually gave me a fancy teacup. And I just felt like, it just felt like you belonged. Like they made you feel like, anyway, I felt treated with respect. And it was just a really beautiful, beautiful memory. So, and this was out at Sarath Elborn. So it was a tiny little church out in the community, out in the sticks. And I just remember also VBS. That was a really big part of us growing up too. So those are my memories. Thank you.
Thanks, Rose. Val and Paul, did you get your sound back yet? No. No, sorry. We'll see. We can introduce you next week. You can be the special introductions next week. We'll do it that way. All right. So then we'll go to Marlene Single. You're next. Can you unmute there, Ron? Are you able to figure out how to do that? There you
Okay,
go.
there. Hi, good morning, everyone. My very first memory is as a little girl, definitely probably 5, 6 years old, maybe even younger. I grew up in a small little village, Elida, Saskatchewan, and our family was Roman Catholic. There weren't too many other churches out there in the community. There was a United Church in town, but it was a big thing to go to church on Sundays because the church was 8 miles out of town. So as a little girl, that was a big journey on Sundays. And pulling into the area was a big thing to me as well, because it was a small village at that time and it was called Cantle. So this is St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church, and it was a beautiful church. It's still open today, and it was just full of big rocks on the outside front of the church, and the steps were astounding. They're these great big wide steps. So as a little girl, I just thought this was a big thing. And then the little village there, they had a little grocery store, and it was a big French community. And I just have all my memories of sitting there, always listening to the priest and just observing and taking in everything that was happening. So those are my earliest memories. I have many more, but
yeah.
Ron, can you go next?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ron Single. My first memory of worship is in a Lutheran church in a small town in Manitoba called Waldersea, and it was a service in German. And I remember going and not understanding what was being said, but it was very popular. Everybody from miles came, and after a certain introduction, then we went down to Sunday school and listened to Pastor Schwint. He was the pastor at that time and said a few words. So it was a big thing to go to church on Sunday in this small community.
Thanks, Ron. And I noticed Leslie had to step away for a minute, and so then things got bounced around. So actually now, Kathy, we're going to go back to you. You're still muted here, Kathy. There you go.
Okay, morning, everyone. It's so nice to see everyone's faces, and like Rose Stats, haven't seen you forever. It's so nice. So it's kind of neat. We're talking about community and experiencing it at the same time. My memories, earliest memories, are all down at St. James Anglican, just down the road from Christ Lutheran. And I think one of the things that I feel like was instilled in me the most was how holy the front of the church was, like the altar. And Mom would help set up communion, and if we went and helped her, we had to be very quiet. We couldn't. There's no running around. There's no talking. You'd always bow at the cross, and so then when we could go up for communion, and just fold your hands across your chest and get a blessing. I just remember from a very young age feeling like we were really in the presence of God, and it's I've just always loved that feeling. So there's lots of other Sunday school and things, but that's the strongest memory that I hold.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. I will jump over to Donna.
Good morning. I'm Donna Huntley, and my earliest memory of going to church or being at church was when I had to, I would, like Brenda, I was about 3 or 4, and I had to go down to nursery school to Sunday school. And I would not stay down there by myself. So my mom had to become a helper. And then she became a Sunday school teacher for about 18 years. So that's my earliest memory.
Thanks, Don. Frederick, you're next on my screen.
Good morning, everyone from Victoria, BC. I like to think I was born Lutheran. So from the very beginning to baptism, my mom and dad and my brother and sister always went to church. So somewhere in there in the election, came up to church, and then Sunday school, confirmation, junior Lutherans Wednesday after school. So never ever stopped coming along through the years, and that in Yorkton, Saskatchewan. Thank you.
Sorry, Frederick, you said Yorkton?
Yeah, St. Paul's Lutheran.
Yeah.
And so occasionally we went to Rhine because my grandparents lived there, and went to the service. And sometimes it was in German because my mom and dad, grandparents all spoke German for the thing. And thankfully, both those churches are still in existence and still operating.
Thanks, Frederick. And then I don't know who owner is. So whoever is owner on the screen, are you able to introduce yourself? Who would that be? I'm not sure. They're not sure. Oh, here we go.
Hello, I'm Hertha Wiley.
Oh, Hertha. Okay.
I don't know why my picture doesn't come up, but I'll have to get Jackson to look into it. My earliest, my earliest remembrance is going to church when I was about 3, 4 in a sleigh with horses, and going to the Christmas concert at the church in Wapella, Saskatchewan. Dad would drive us there, unload us, and then he'd have to go and take the horses to the livery barn. And that's my earliest remembrance.
Thanks, Hertha. Well, that's Hertha Wiley, everyone. All right, and then Miriam, you're next on my screen. Are you able to unmute yourself here, Miriam? Not yet. Are you there, Miriam? Maybe she's not there right now. Well, we'll come back to you, Miriam. Let's go to Peter next, because I know that Peter was able to unmute.
Hi, good morning. It's been wonderful to hear everybody's stories. I certainly can't beat going in a sleigh pulled by horses, that's for sure. My earliest memories would go back all dressed up as a small boy with the family, going to church at St. Paul's Presbyterian Church in Hamilton, Ontario. So probably going back to about age 3 or 4. Think of a big, massive church with many pews. It's always packed. We actually belonged to pew 85. And it had a little door you had to open up and sit in there. Grandmother was part of the choir, so it was always a big thing to see her before the church started. You'd look way up the stairs as a little boy to see grandmother looking down, and then she'd march out with the preacher, the minister, at the start of the service, and she'd be sitting down in the choir loft. And so, yeah, that's part of my early memories. Sunday school was very important, and lots of memories there. Yeah, I think, oh, and many stained glass windows. There's no question that was raised earlier. That had a big impression on me. Stained glass windows everywhere in that big, big church. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. And for those of you who are not aware, Peter Davis was, I think, our first sort of new member joined digitally. And so he lives in South Porcupine. And well, there we go. So Miriam is joining maybe with a different device. That might be what you're doing. So yeah, thanks, Peter. So now, Miriam, are you able to unmute now? And Oh, there you go.
Yes. Yeah. I'll tell you, Carla was helping me. Hello from Florida. But yes, my earliest memory. Well, we only had services once, maybe every 3 months or 6 months, and in the homes because it was German. And somebody from the States would come over, some pastor, but I didn't go to the service. I was busy with doing other things. But my earliest memories, it also taking Bibles, the Bible school, or VBS in our country school, and a couple of missionary ladies came from Winnipeg, and they had the flannel graph, the flannel board. It was the most wonderful thing to have the pictures up, and that's where I learned to love the Bible, because I just loved watching the pictures, and they came so alive, the Bible stories.
Well, that's two people who were impressed with flannel graph.
That's right.
In this group. So I remember flannel graph. I remember putting the sheep upside down and thinking, that was a funny joke. Anyway, so now let's see, we have the Mrazeks. So you want to say hello and give your memories?
Yes, good morning, everyone. I grew up near Zion Lutheran Church at Wheatwin, growing up on the farm, and went there for many years until we moved to the church in Markinch, St. Mark's. Now, my earliest memory, I guess, is from the Wheatwin Lutheran Church when I was about 3 years old. And we went faithfully every Sunday, my family and myself. And my job Saturday night was polishing Dad's and my brother's shoes. That had to happen every week. And service, it was a bit of a mystery to me as a young child, because at that time, the men and the women did not sit together in the church. And I believe it was even in German, the service for some time, until I was about 5. And then we sat together and we had English service. So it was very meaningful then. And of course, Sunday school every Sunday and vacation Bible school growing up. Those are really fond memories. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Helen. Ron.
I'm Ron Mrazek. My memories are just we always got dressed up on Sunday and went to church as a family. I guess I would remember I have that one sister or 2 sisters maybe at that time. But that's where everybody went. The service was it was a Catholic service, and it was the mass was in Latin, and so it was. I don't remember any of the Gospels if there were any preaching going on or anything, but that's what we did on Sunday because all our relatives were there too, and it was all visiting.
Okay, good. Thanks, Ron. All right, so that's pretty. I think that's everyone except for me. I haven't. And the Davies. Are we just going to wait till next week? Are you going to try one more time?
Are we working now? Can you hear us?
There you are.
All right. Okay, Paul, go ahead.
Oh, my earliest memory of going to church is walking down a country path in the UK and hearing the church bells. And the closer we got to the church, the bells got louder and louder, obviously. And I remember I was so terribly embarrassed because it was Easter Sunday and my mother was bringing the eggs, our Easter eggs, to be blessed at church. And I was so embarrassed. Anyway, Val.
Yeah, that he has other memories, but that's interesting. My memory, of course, is being raised on a farm just down south of Weyburn near Torquay, and the church that I went to was La Caparle, and it was like just going home. It was all the Petersons went to La Caparle. I was a Peterson, and that's what we did. It was like just another gathering of the Petersons, and others came to church as well, but we were a large group. And it was great. It was just family. We were in church. We sang, and we loved to sing. The Petersons were pretty good singers. And it's a great memory for me. We had, I remember, my aunts and uncles were all participating in the services. They would you'd be the people that worked at communion or picked up the offering or did vacation Bible school. It was all my relatives. So I was just like part of family. And it was like this whole presentation of yours, Pastor Dennis, is about community. I was raised in community because afterwards, after it was over, we ate together. We always had a hot meal. So that's just my idea of church and how I was raised. So, and that went on for my whole life until I left.
Hey, thanks, Val. Glad we were able to get your stories too. And if Leslie comes back, we'll get her to do this as well. But it's only fair that I tell you mine. So when I was a kid, until I think it was I was about 6 or 7. Prior to that, we went out to there was no Lutheran church in Brooks. So we went out to the country church in the district of Tilly, which was a Danish Lutheran community. And so we would get up and drive. It was probably about 15 miles. We drive out to this church, and it has a particular unique architecture that's sort of unique to Danish churches. And what I remember, my earliest memory is not actually like it's a misbehavior on my part in the church. There was a balcony at the back, and it wasn't really used for the choir. So it wasn't a choir balcony. It was just a balcony, and there was a few pews up there and stuff. And of course, the kids would like to go up in there, especially after the service. And I went up there and was fooling around with some of the older kids. And they showed me that what you could do is you could tear some of the back pages out of the hymnals and make paper airplanes out of them and throw them from the balcony. So I remember doing that, and yeah, it was like, I don't know, that was not a good memory, but because when my parents found out, then that was not good. So, but that space had a definite feel about it, because same thing. It was Vacation Bible School. I went there when I was like 5. And it was an all-day thing. My grandma packed me a lunch. My grandparents lived about a mile from the church, maybe not even a full mile. It might have been just a half a mile. But yeah. All right. So now here's the interesting thing. All of us have some kind of story about this experience of gathering with a church community in some way or another, whether it was in homes, like in house churches, or whether it was in a big building with stained glass windows, but most of the stories have to do with the people, right? And that's really, I think, that tells us something about what is important, really. Like the space can be important, but it's primarily the people, and we'll get to that. So I appreciate everyone sharing their stories, and I mean, it's a large group, so that took a little bit of time, but I wanted to do that so that you had a sense of connection with each other, both those of you who are watching online and those of you who are in the room. So now we have kind of a sense of who people are. But now I think what we're going to do is we're going to get into the content of the study here. And so I'm going to see if I can get this figured out. So the first thing that I want to start with is the concept that faith is relational. The very concept of faith is relational. You have faith in someone, right? In some being. And there's a famous psychologist named James Fowler who wrote a book called Stages of Faith. And in it, he talks about he identified 9 stages of faith. As faith matures, there's sort of 9 stages. But he was the one who stated just blankly, directly, faith is relational. It cannot be anything other than. So when we think about faith and faith formation, we understand then from the beginning that faith is relational. And it has to do with our connections with God, and I would suggest also with one another. So when we look at the Bible, how does the Bible show us that faith is relational? Well, the first thing is the very concept of the triune God. Now, the word Trinity or triune is not actually named in Scripture. Like, you will not find that word in biblical text, but you will certainly find the three persons of the Trinity mentioned, and in some cases, all mentioned together, particularly, obviously, in the New Testament. The Hebrew Scriptures would not have Jesus included, but there are hints at it. One of them is in the Genesis story, you have God saying, let us make humans in our image. Let us. So there's a plural there. And it's like, so then that was always a mystery. Where is this plurality coming from when we believed in one God? Why would God say, let us make humans? So some used to say, well, God was speaking to the angels. But others have interpreted that plural expression as an expression of the Trinity that's right there in the Hebrew Scriptures, but doesn't get fully understood until Christ himself comes and reveals the connection between the three parts of the Trinity. So, and we'll touch on this more as we go along, this idea that the very nature of the Trinity tells us that God is relational. So do you remember, like, in the creation story, this is in chapter 2 of Genesis, God identifies a problem with the human that he has created. What is the problem? Yeah, it is not good for the man to be alone. So he needs a suitable partner, right? And so there's even a recognition in the beginning that relationship is central to our human experience. And because we are made in the image of God, then it should not surprise us then that God is relational too. So that the triune nature of God says that even within God's very being, there is relationship, right? And how that works is a little bit mind-bending, right? Anytime you start talking about the Trinity. I don't know if you know this, but there are some scholars who suggest that Islam started because Muhammad could not make sense of the Trinity. And because it was a monotheistic God that, that they were basing on, the God of Abraham and Sarah, right? That Jesus was sort of demoted then, was a prophet, but could not be part of God. Now, there's debate about that, but it's a difficult concept. But not if you think about it in terms of relationship, that God is all about relationship. Then it's maybe a little easier to kind of grasp. Instead of trying to figure out exactly how the different persons of God, how they function or how we are to understand them, just understand that the very nature of God is relational, right? Okay, so that's that. Creation is relational. So in the creation story, in the story where God, this is in chapter 2. So there's two creation stories, right? Chapter 1 is the 6 days of creation, and then the 7th being Sabbath. And it's structured like a poem, and it tells us about creation being orderly and intentional. Chapter 2 tells us more of the relational story. So God creates the world, creates the garden, and then creates Adam, which literally means earth being. That would maybe be the best way to translate that word, Adam, is earth being. And then gives life to this being by breathing God's spirit into it, right? And the clay being then becomes human. And then, do you remember what God asks the human to do so Adam, right? What does God ask Adam to do when he's trying to find a suitable partner? What does Adam do? I wonder if any of you can remember.
Name the animal.
Name the animals. So the different animals come and Adam names them, right? We name things that we have a relationship with. And even inanimate objects we sometimes name. So for example, did any of you give a name to your first car? And then did you talk to your car in the middle of winter when it was really cold and you're saying things like, come on, Betsy, I know you can do this. Come on, here we go. You know, like we even name inanimate objects that we have some kind of relationship with. But the naming, the fact that Adam is naming things indicates relationship, right? And then, of course, you have the creation of Eve, you know, to be a partner with, created out of the rib because it's to be beside and to work together. So right at the very beginning, creation is relational. And then God tells the humans that they have a responsibility to tend the earth, right? They are stewards of the earth. And so there's a relationship even with the other parts of creation, right? So we are not isolated bits. We are always in relationship with others, in relationship with the world around us, and in relationship with God. So that's there from the very beginning as well. Now, another hint that the Bible tells us that faith is relational is to look at the concept of covenant. So covenant is a big thing, particularly in the Hebrew scriptures. You know, God makes a covenant with Abraham, and then God makes a covenant with David. And there's other forms of covenant that show up too. There's sort of a covenant that's made with Noah. A covenant is not a contract in the sense that it's this, it's just sort of a legal document that tells you that these are the conditions that, you know, will result in these results. And if you break these conditions, then this is the penalty. You know, it's like that's sort of, you know, legal language. But covenantal language is far more relational. So it's talking about the relationship that two parties would have. And it could be two different nations, or it could be two individuals. But the relational aspect is central. This, by the way, is one of the interesting things that is happening now as we are dealing with the treaties made with indigenous peoples, because they function very similar to, I would say, Old Testament peoples. Like it was all about relationship, and it wasn't about legalities in the sense of sort of something separate from the relationship. It was about the relationship. And so we're learning that even the way that indigenous peoples understood what the treaties were and how they functioned and how we looked at them as you know, Europeans who had immigrated here, as two different ways of looking. So I think their understanding of treaty would be similar then to the understanding of covenant in the Old Testament. It was about relationship. So we have this relationship, and this is how this relationship is going to work. That's kind of what covenants were. And so God makes covenants with his people, right? And he says, and this gives you the relational component, you know, I will be your God and you will be my people. So there's the relationship, you know, identifying, you know, what that relationship is. And remembering that when these covenants were made, you know, other peoples in the area had their own gods, right? And the Hebrew people said, well, actually, there is only one true God, but that God has called us into relationship. So we are in relationship with Yahweh, the one true God. And so other people have relationships with their gods, but those relationships cannot have a successful conclusion because those gods aren't real. So how can you have a relationship with something that's unreal or not existent? So that's why you have stories like Elijah making fun of the prophets of Baal, you know, because they're trying everything to get Baal to you know, respond, and there's no respond, and Elijah says, well, maybe he's sleeping, maybe he'll yell a little louder, maybe he'll wake up, you know. And he's making fun of this because he says, or he thinks, you think you have a relationship with this God Baal, but that God Baal isn't real. So nothing's going to happen. And then for the people of Israel, when they look at their history, and this is going to be important, when they look at their history, they would say, well, we know that this relationship with God is real. Because why? Because these things happened. God did these things in history. And so then that relationship is real because God is real, right? So the biggest event that the Hebrew people would look back on is, what do you think? What's the biggest event that they would always point back to?
Leaving Egypt.
Right, the Exodus out of Egypt. Because they would say that would not have happened had not God intervened with God's power, right? So that covenantal. And then God would speak to the people of Israel and say, "Have you forgotten what I did for you in the past? And now you're chasing after these other gods." And then God would often frame it, and this is interesting, even in the Old Testament, you find it in the New Testament too, but God frames those relationships even as like a marriage relationship. So it's like the spouse cheating on the other, like you're chasing after these other gods. It's like you're breaking this covenantal relationship, which is like a marriage, right? You're breaking that. And you're chasing after these other gods that aren't even real, and so then it's like God being upset. So at the breaking of the relationship. So this is important so that you understand that, because all too often what it became is, here are the rules, keep the rules, and that's the only thing that matters. But that's not it. What it is the rules are intended to keep the relationship. And that's the important thing. And so when you look at the 10 Commandments, you see that they're really based on how do we live in relationship with God and in relationship with one another. And it's all about relationship, right? All of those commandments at their core are about healthy relationships. How do you maintain healthy relationships? So that's just a general overview. So wherever you look in scripture, you're going to find stuff about faith being relational, and that what God intends is for the relationship between us and God is strengthened, and that it also leads to a change in our life so that our relationship with one another is made better. Okay, all right. So now, and I obviously did that wrong, so that's all right. So the communal nature of faith seen throughout the Bible, here are some of the things. The family of Abraham. So the fact that the covenant is made, and it's made with a family. So you and your descendants, right? And so the family, of course, is our basic relational structure that we grow up, most of us anyways, we grow up in a family, and that's how we learn who we are and how we fit into this world, right? Then there's the concept of the nation of Israel, as they understood themselves as a distinct nation, different from all other nations. And then when we get to the New Testament, we find Jesus gathering disciples right from the very beginning. The first thing he does when he starts his ministry is he gathers disciples and forms a small community that travels with him as he goes around teaching and preaching. And then when we get into the post-resurrection story, we find that Christian community starts to identify itself as family, calling each other brothers and sisters, and forming house churches, all throughout the empire, wherever the gospel gets to. But that concept of family and that concept of community, belonging, that's there throughout. So a couple of pictures to remind us of this. So the whole important story of the people of Israel starts with, this elderly couple that is not able to have children, but yet the covenantal promise is that your descendants will become very numerous, more numerous than all the stars in the sky, and will be a blessing to all nations, right? And yet there's no child. How can this happen? And then miraculously, in their old age, they have a child. And then that child, has a couple, but one of them, Jacob, has his name changed to Israel, and Israel has 12 sons, and that begins the 12 tribes of Israel. But it starts with this very relational story, right? So that's how really the covenantal stuff starts. And then we mentioned this, that the people of Israel, so after the Exodus, they really sort of form a strong identity about who we are when they're wandering in the wilderness, right? It's in the wilderness that they get the Ten Commandments. It's in the wilderness that the Torah, the first form of the Torah, comes to them, and they begin to say, this is how we know who we are, because God has told us how to be in relationship with God and with one another. And this is the gift. So they always understood the Torah as gift, because wow, we've got instructions from God about how to be in relationship with God and with one another. And no other peoples have had this instruction. That we are blessed to have this instruction. And I remember as a kid thinking that, the Ten Commandments or any of the commandments in the Bible were just there to ruin our fun. Right? Like, I mean, that was because they were laws, and laws always, laws always, tell, like, here's a law that I remember as a kid: don't take cookies out of the cookie jar. Well, that's just ruining your fun. That's all that is, right? But what your parents knew, of course, is that you get too much sugar. That's not good for your teeth, and it's not good for you, and it's not good for us, because you're going to be wired and running around the house like a crazy kid. So, you're supposed to be back there.
Yet they had doubts.
What's that?
Yet they had doubts.
Yeah, explain that.
Well, they built the golden calf, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, they saw a miracle.
Yeah,
A miracle to save them.
Yeah.
And yet, as soon as those.
Yeah, no, I think actually what you see in the scriptures, and one of the reasons why I think the Bible is particularly unique in ancient documents is because it shows all the warts, right? The heroes, even the heroes, are very flawed, some of them. Abraham, we just looked at Abraham, right? Abraham, at one point, tries to pass off his wife as his sister so the Pharaoh, doesn't cause any trouble for him, right? And then, of course, the people in the wilderness, they could see all these miracles. What do? They say, you know what? We're sick of this one item menu, manna. We're tired of manna. We want to go back to Egypt, where at least we had leeks. We could have leeks with the manna. So it's a very real portrayal of human propensity to turn their back on positive relationships. And they do it all the time. And to me, that's why I think the Bible has a level of authenticity that you don't find in much of the ancient mythological stories, because that human flawedness is missing. And that's oversimplification, but that's it. So anyways, they form their identity as a people, as a nation now. They're no longer just a family. They're now a nation, and this nation is going to take its place in the world stage. Now, one of the interesting things about history is that nation and that little strip of land, which was called the Promised Land, has been central in world history from that point on. It's still to this day, right? Still to this day. And it's not that big of a piece of land. Really, and yet it's astounding how often it shows up in world history in one form or another, or those people show up in one way or another. All right, then we get to what's going on? Jesus gathering his disciples, and I like this picture because we've got Jesus, and they're gathered around a little fire. It's kind of like what sometimes you like to do. Like, I don't know if you like camping and then have a little bonfire, and then you sit around and you talk about things. And it's just a sort of an informal environment, and it's relaxed. And Jesus did that with his disciples. Like, they were not just students, which is what disciple means, right? But they were also friends, in a sense, right? Like, they shared experiences, and they shared meals, and they did things together. And yes, Jesus was the leader, but sometimes some of them felt like they should take a leadership role. And Peter tells Jesus at one point, no, you shouldn't do that. Oh, this would really freak out Joshua. And so this, I like this painting because Jesus is sort of just talking, and they're just kind of sitting around listening and whatnot. Plus, you have some women in there, And what we know is the 12 disciples were male, but that's because they had to represent the 12 tribes. In a patriarchal society, it would be impossible. But we know that there were women disciples also who followed Jesus around, and some of them funded the ministry. We know that too. So I like when artwork includes women in the paintings, because they were there too, learning from Jesus. We have the famous story of Mary and Martha and at Bethany, and Jesus is teaching, and Mary is listening, and Martha is busy doing stuff. And Martha comes and complains to Jesus and says, "Would you tell Mary to get into the kitchen and help me?" And Jesus says, "No, no, Martha, you get all uptight about all kinds of things, but Mary has chosen the best thing." So there's Mary listening as a disciple, and that's the point I'm making there. All right. And then the early church, which met in houses, like house churches, were there from the very beginning. That's where they met, and they would talk and they would share. And I like this picture because we got kids in it. And kids would have been part of the households too, right? So no different than the house churches that some of you, started off life in. There would have been kids around, right? And we'll learn now when we get to our next passage here, we'll learn that actually is something that is part of the biblical story, is that children are part of the faith story. They're part of the relational story in its own unique way. All right, now, what are we at here? Okay, so we've taken just a little over an hour. So what we're going to do now, before we get into Nehemiah, because that's where we're moving next, we're moving to Nehemiah, is I'm going to give you just a 5-minute break to stand up, stretch. There's some coffee and some Timbits over there that I picked up this morning. So feel free to grab a coffee, or if you need to go to the washroom or whatever, to stretch, and then we'll reconvene in 5 minutes, okay? 5 minutes. Can you hear me, Leslie?
Yes,
Okay, you missed the introduction, or
I did.
To you. Would you be willing to say who you are and your earliest memory of being in worship?
My name is Leslie Fraser, and my earliest memory is at Christ Lutheran Church, sitting in the education center on those gray chairs. And I'm in my little dress, because you had to wear little dresses and knee highs, and my legs were always freezing. So I remember being so interested and excited to be there, but always feeling so cold in the church. And then when we would be in the services in the Nakurity pew in the front row, I too felt sometimes, Brenda, like Pastor Kurtz was speaking to me. And his big booming voice and the jokes he would tell. And when he sang a hymn, you could hear the rafters soaring with that hymn. And I remember many of the wonderful teachers I had, like the Fletchers, the Cudmores, all the people, the Tanks, who did just wonderful work with us as youth in the church. And I so appreciated my confirmation classes with Pastor Bob and Pastor Kurtz. And I really feel blessed to have had the opportunity to grow within this church. And I'm so thrilled to be back now from St. Mark's back home to Christ Lutheran.
Thanks, Leslie. Appreciate that. So now, oh man, maybe if I do that, what do? That's just, oh, where am I? Let's see if I do this. And then if I do this, oh, good, we're good. All right. So now we're looking at Nehemiah 8 and 9. So I don't know if any of you had a chance to read those chapters, but we're going to go through them. It's fairly good detail. In fact, I'm going to probably spend more time on this section than on the other two biblical stories, because there's just so much in this section. So first of all, a little bit of historical setting. So this is when this happens, this scene in Nehemiah, This is in the post-exilic period. So they have been in Babylon, but now they've returned back to the land, and they're trying to get themselves reestablished in the land. So what we have is we have a challenge for Ezra and Nehemiah. Nehemiah was sort of the administrator, and Ezra was the priest. And their challenge is that they need to reestablish the people of Israel in the land. So they like this group that had been away, and they're now when the exile happened, I should explain this. So when the exile happened, you know what? I'm going to do this with the map. Okay. So this is a map of the ancient Near East and the Babylonian Empire. And I see it. You can't really see the color as well, but the empire, Babylonian Empire, kind of extends from here all the way down into the Persian Gulf, and then down here into Egypt. That was the Babylonian Empire, and they were not the first empire to encroach upon the people of Israel and the 12 tribes of Israel. The first empire were the Assyrian Empire. And do you remember the story of Jonah? Do you remember where he was supposed to go to? Nineveh, right? So here's Nineveh up here. And that was the capital city of the Assyrian Empire. So a little bit north of the Babylonian Empire, and not quite as far east as well. So the Assyrians come in, and they take over the northern kingdom, which is the 10 tribes that were known as Israel. And when they take over, they destroy those tribes. They disperse them all over. One of their strategies was they brought people in to settle the land, and they took the people from that land elsewhere to settle land elsewhere. So you no longer had a connection with the land. And that was one of the ways they subjugated people. So then you no longer felt like you're going to fight for your land, because you're not even in your land anymore. And this was one of the things that dispersed the 10 tribes. So the 10 north, sometimes known as the 10 lost tribes, right? So that's the first empire. But the southern kingdom, which was Judah, which you see is still named on the map here, and it was made up of just 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. That was the only 2 tribes. And it didn't get taken over by the Assyrians. But when the Babylonians came through, they took over Judah as well, because you could tell, because they went down into Egypt here, right? Okay. So when they took over, they took with them back to Babylon. They took the upper class, the educated, the skilled craftsmen, the people who could read and write and could do the administrative work and the sort of the skilled trades. It'd be like taking engineers and university professors and stuff like that today, and so that they took them to Babylon. So this is Babylon here on the shore of the Euphrates River. Now the irony is, where do the people of Israel originally come from? That's exactly where they came from originally. Abraham and Sarah came from this region. It wasn't Babylon, but this region. Okay, and now they're being brought back there by force. But they weren't enslaved in Babylon, but they weren't allowed to go home either. Sort of like, you have to work for us here, but you can have your own homes, and you can even do your own worship. In fact, some people speculate that synagogue worship began in Babylon because they didn't have the temple anymore. So what could they do? So they met in houses, and then that was sort of the roots of the synagogue system. But it wasn't everyone, but it was all the educated, all the upper class or skilled people. Now, when Babylon gets taken over by the Persian Empire, then the Persian king, we'll call him, says, okay, you Israelites, if you want, you can go back to your land. And so then there was a couple of return trips, right? And so then these people who were in Babylon are now back in the land of Judah, and they're mingling with, or they're trying to get along with the people who had stayed there. By the way, this is also the roots of the Samaritans, because some of the people who stayed there, here is Samaria, some of the people who stayed there who weren't taken into exile, then they started marrying people of other religious and ethnic groups. And so then that mixture, it'd be like Métis. The Samaritans were like Métis. So a mixture of two different kind of peoples, people who had a Hebrew heritage and people who were also in the region. One of the things that's a little bit confusing when you're trying to deal with this is to know that it was never just monolithic people in this land. There were always others who were around or close by, whether it be the Moabites, and we know about them from the story of Ruth, or the Samaritans, because they mixed in with some of these people up there. Anyways, so now here's the challenge for Ezra and Nehemiah. How do we reestablish the people of Israel in a way that would make it back to the way that it was intended? Now, here's a quick timeline that I'll put up here for you. So you notice here's the Assyrian Empire, which took over the northern kingdom, right? And you can see that between 650 and 600 about, I'm just rounding these things up. Down here, you can see sort of the prophets who were connected with those different time periods. Then the Babylonian Empire, and then the Persian Empire, when the Persians take over. And then the first return is in 536, and Zerubbabel, that's one of those great biblical names, right there. And you get the early chapters of Ezra is related to that first return. But then the second return is over 100 years later, return with, this is the second part of Ezra, and then you get Nehemiah. So there's these different groups that come back at different times. So now you've got all these groups who are in this land. How are they going to get themselves established? All right. So what happens in these chapters is that we see three rituals that happen. And these rituals are important in terms of establishing the identity and the faith life of the people of Israel. And the one you heard on Sunday was the first one, the reading of the Torah. And what this did is this gave them an awareness of their relationship with God, and help them understand how that relationship was to be lived out in the present. So that's the interpretation part, right? And then the next thing was the festival of the booths, or Sukkot, and this was and I'll explain these all more in a few minutes here. But this was an historic festival that was actually prescribed way earlier, right? And it was to remember the wilderness wanderings at the time of the Exodus. That was its primary purpose. But what they did is they built these booths or these little temporary structures out of sticks or branches or leaves, and then they lived in them for a week. And that was to remind them of this wilderness wandering period, but then also to remind them of that, what God had done and who they were. So it was helping them form their identity and helping them remember what had happened in the past. And then the third thing that happens is the covenant renewal. And the covenant renewal is where the relationship between the people and God is reestablished and reinvigorated. So what happens is when the people hear the Torah being read, they recognize that they have not been faithful to that covenant relationship, and that they need to renew it. They need to reinvigorate it. It's a little bit like you can think of a couple. If a couple had, renews their marriage vows, like let's say their 25th wedding anniversary, they're going to renew their marriage vows. It's not as if the original vows were not effective anymore, but it's just a way of saying we're recommitting to this relationship as we move forward. And that's what's happening in this in this covenant renewal. They're recommitting to the relationship with God. Now, one of the things that I found interesting is that what you see in all of these three is confession and celebration. So there's a confession, an admission that, oh, we have not been following this relationship. We've not been following this covenant, and we have forgotten who we are. So that's sort of the confession part. And then the celebration is, but now we remember, and now we are celebrating this relationship that we have with God, and so forth. So that's the three things that happen in Nehemiah. So if you have your Bibles handy, we're going to start looking at specific passages now. So the first depiction of communal activity is the people gathering to hear the reading of the Torah. And you will find this in chapter 8, verses 1 to 12. Now, depending on your translation, you may actually need to start with the last verse or the last half of the verse of Nehemiah 7. So I'm going to start there. When the 7th month came, the people of Israel, being settled in their town, all the people gathered together in the square before the water gate. So that previous half a verse in chapter 7 just says, so now they've come back and they've settled now, but they're settled throughout the land. They're not all living in Jerusalem. But now they go to Jerusalem. They've been gathered together, called by Nehemiah to do this. And then they gather. And they gather in the square before the water gate. So we have a very specific place named, that gives some sort of historical veracity to this. So this is like, because they're naming the place and they're naming the sort of the situation, circumstances, we can be assured that something like this happened. So once they gather, then I'm carrying on here in chapter 8. They told the scribe Ezra to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had given to Israel. Accordingly, the priest Ezra brought the law before the assembly, before men and women, and all who could hear with understanding. Okay, and that's an important phrase that you might pass over. So then Ezra does this, right? This was on the first day of the 7th month. He read from it facing the square before the water gate from the early morning until midday in the presence of the men and the women and those who could understand, and the ears of all the people were attentive to the book of the law. Okay, so they listened for a big chunk of time, which you would actually need to do if you're reading the whole of the Torah, right? So what we understand as the Torah now would be the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So that's what's being read from, because in there you have the laws, like particularly you find in Leviticus, the 10 Commandments are repeated in there, and you have the story of the Exodus and the story of creation, and like all this stuff is in there. And it would take a while to read all that. Okay, so now both as literacy and copies of the Torah were limited at that time, so not very many people could read. And there were not that many scrolls available. Like, it wasn't like today where, we've got these devices that can print off as many copies as we want. Everything had to be done by hand, including making the material that the scrolls were made with, and then handwritten, right? So both literacy and copies of the Torah were limited. So public reading of the Torah was necessary so that all the people could know what was in the law of Moses. So if they didn't do this public reading, most of the people wouldn't know what was in there. So gathering to hear the reading of these faith-shaping texts allowed for conversation among the people as they sought to understand the implications of the Torah for their lives. So listen to this. Now I'm starting at verse 4. The scribe Ezra stood on a wooden platform that had been made for the purpose. And beside him stood, and then we've got a bunch of names. So there's 12 people who end up standing there. And then verse 5. And Ezra opened the book in the sight of all the people, book or scroll, right? And for he was standing above all the people. And when he opened it, all the people stood up. So now you've got Ezra, he's got the scrolls here. And now he's going to open the scrolls. And when he's opening the scrolls, which means that now we're going to start reading, without it seems to even be prompted, the people just stand up. Like this is something important. And to show their attention, which is why I think they stand, to show their attention. We are focused. We're facing you and we're going to listen. Okay. So now what happens next? Then this verse 6, then Ezra blessed the Lord, the great God, and all the people answered, Amen, Amen, lifting up their hands. So there's a prayer. He's giving a prayer of thanksgiving before he starts reading, and all the people respond, Amen, Amen. This, by the way, is a pattern then that we still repeat to this day. So we say Amen at the end of a prayer as a way of affirming that we are in agreement with this prayer, right? Because that's essentially what Amen means, right? And so then after they did that, then they bowed their heads and worshiped the Lord with their faces to the ground. And then we get these 12 people who are up there on the platform with Ezra. And what did they do? They helped the people. This is the middle of verse 7. They helped the people to understand the law while the people remained in their places. So they read from the book, from the law of God with interpretation. They gave sense so that the people understood the reading. Okay, so we've got these 12 people who seem to be given the task of helping the people understand. So what a lot of the scholars thought happened then is that a portion of scripture be read, and then these 12 would go out amongst the people and sit with them and converse with them about the meaning of this. There are some who also suggested that they need to translate. Why do they need to translate? Because the people no longer spoke Hebrew. What they were speaking at that time was the same language that Jesus spoke, which is, does anyone know? Aramaic. Now, Aramaic is related to Hebrew, so they probably could understand parts of it, but not necessarily all of it. So there's a good chance that these 12 assistants went amongst the people and then said, now, do you understand what was said there? And then they not only then helped explain maybe translation stuff, but also context stuff. How does this apply to us now? Or how do we fit into this story? Or things like that. So the interpretation was an important part of what was going on here. So it's not just reading and hearing this Torah, it's then thinking about it, talking about it, and doing so in groups, which is exactly what we're doing now. And I think that the group setting is essential to a fuller understanding of Scripture, because no one person is going to be able to always grasp all the different, perspectives going on in a passage. And sometimes somebody will offer, and this has happened lots of times in Bible studies here, someone from the group will offer something that I had not seen or thought about. And that adds to the fullness of our interpretation of what's going on. So key word here is interpretation. That was required as well. Mary.
Did they develop the memory? Well, a lot of people didn't read. Were there certain people who started memorizing and, for their area? Did that start developing again?
I suspect that some of that started even in Babylon. And one of the things that they would have been memorizing is no different than what we do today, which is memorizing songs. Right? So the book of Psalms was one of the things that they would start with memory work. And one of the things we know about the book of Psalms is there are some Psalms that are acrostic, meaning each verse begins, or in case of Psalm 119, or is it 118? Each chapter, or not chapter, but each paragraph begins with the next letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And so we know, based on that was a memory device. So then these were things that were memorized, right? And often used to teach children. So some of that would be going on here. But again, if you never even heard some of these scriptures before, You wouldn't have known to memorize. Now, after this, I can understand that there would probably be people who would identify as being what would eventually become rabbis, the local expert in the law. Because that's really what a rabbi was. Like, he was the one who, and it's always a male in those days, he was the one who was responsible for knowing and interpreting the Torah for their little community. So a synagogue could be formed if you had 10 families. 10 families could gather together and form a synagogue. And so you can imagine in all these little villages, and we know that these villages had synagogues because by the time we get to Jesus, there's synagogues, and he goes to the synagogues all the time, right? So whether he's in Nazareth or in some other village around the Galilee district, right? Many of them had synagogues. Why? Because there was at least 10 Jewish families there that established that. And they would have done some of this memory work. Yeah.
Dennis?
Yes.
In verse 1, it says that they were told to go get the laws of Moses that God had given to Israel.
Yes.
Which I assumed, probably obviously incorrectly, was the Ten Commandments. Who wrote the Torah, and when did this get given to Moses?
Okay, so in the tradition of the Hebrew people, Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. What modern biblical scholars would say is it's very unlikely that Moses was responsible for all 5 books, because there's material in there that actually comes after him, right? So, but they're often called, and Hebrew people still to this day, and Jewish people will call them the books of Moses. All right. What biblical scholarship suggests is that the stories were handed on orally, like these things were handed on from generation to generation orally, mostly. And then they started to get written down in a written form in Babylon. Probably that's where the writing of this became where all the material was gathered into those 5 books. Yeah.
And that's why extra things would be added on.
Yes.
Up further length time had been.
That's right. So a later scribe, maybe to help explain, like connect the dots between things, might add material. But it was all material that had been passed down. Like, no one was making stuff up, in the sense that I think I should add a story about, I'll make something up about, so and so. No, there wasn't that. But the centerpiece of the Torah is indeed the 10 Commandments. So sometimes when they talk about the Torah, you have to be careful. They're referring to the 10 Commandments, and sometimes they're referring to the 5 books of Moses. So the written material. So now this is after Babylon. So we know that they've had chance for this to be written down and put into a scroll form. Right.
Previously, it said the Babylonian Empire was 600 BC, so this is a long time.
This is a couple of centuries later. A couple of centuries after the conquest, I should say. Right? Yeah. That's the other thing when we're looking at biblical material. We have to remember that some of the timelines here are way longer than we might imagine. Right? So this is literally a couple of centuries later that this scene is happening. And it really kind of sets the stage for the form of Judaism that is in place at the time of Jesus.
And the Torah being written down would have been many centuries after Moses.
That's right.
Saying it's 600 BC.
That's right.
You have to go.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how much of that. I mean, we want to say that it all stays true, but there's interpretation over hundreds of years for things to change a little bit. If it's all word of mouth.
Yeah, and one of the things that we have difficulty understanding is the way that cultures that are based on oral traditions, how the stories do in fact stay fairly consistent. Like that was an important thing for them. But this is one of the reasons why it's stories, because humans think in a narrative structure, right? So we think story. There's characters, there's setting, there's action, and we can kind of keep that in line. We can see, this event leads to this event, leads to this event. And so what I could say is, while perhaps specific wording would have changed over the centuries, the core stories and their meanings would have been fairly consistent. And one of the things we know is that they've been able to find certain historical evidence, and some of the wording on just often it's small, but it's like a victory column has got some stuff on there about a fight with the Israelites or whatever, and then we go, oh well, historically speaking, then we know this happened, but most of that is lost to history, other than the document that we have in front of us. Yeah, Marianne.
Yeah, I got the children's Bible from the library here. It's quite in-depth and fascinating. Well, it's the Bible, but it explains it in pretty clear, simple form. How did it ask questions and answers as if the children were, right there. And they talked about the hundreds of years in captivity, and they were working underground to keep their faith alive. And it said, as an example, in the evenings before bed, they taught the children that they are the real people of God, and that God will, in his time, bring them out. Then think of all the people and generations that died in captivity, and so those children prayed, and they often said in the evenings as they gathered, to have time alone. And the Egyptians didn't know this. I had that. And so then the next generation and the next, how did they know that now is the time for you to be freed? How did you know? Well, because mom and grandma and had told me. So they were kind of underground, is the way they explained it.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's what you're expressing is the faith that did hold on, right, was passed on through families primarily, right? So the parents passing on stuff, and of course, I mean, they're subjects of the empire. So the empire is saying, well, obviously our gods are the powerful ones and the real ones. And they would make fun. So the psalm by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and we wept when we remembered Zion. And that's partly because the Babylonians are making fun of them and saying, hey, why don't you sing us one of your songs? So there's a recognition that the Babylonians didn't always insist that that sometimes that you had to worship what was the name of this? Was it Nebuchadnezzar? Said, you got to worship this thing. But for the most part, they were allowed their own thing as long as they didn't interfere with the Babylonian religion, right? So they could do this. It didn't have to be totally underground, but it certainly wasn't anything that was really public, because they would be made fun of. They would be maybe made a target of hatred, right? And stuff. So it wasn't always underground, not in the same way that, for example, in Soviet Union, sometimes that really had to be kind of underground stuff. So, all right, go ahead, Ray.
Well, the Babylonians were a very sophisticated society.
Yeah.
They were very advanced at that time. So the Jewish people would have learned a lot about how to set up a society.
Yeah.
And how to, at least in the physical sense, run things.
Yeah. And in fact, you could say the same would be true even of their time in slavery in Egypt, because at the time Egypt was the most highest form of civilization in that region, and they would learn from them too, right? So we learn from each other, even as we hold on to our own identity. You still can learn things like how to structure, like I'm sure that some of the civil structure that they brought back with them from Babylon, was put in place in Israel. So now, those of you who are online, one of the things that I didn't express earlier is how you could raise a question if you had a question. And there's two ways you could do it. Either you just take your thing off mute and then just say, hello, I've got a question, get my attention that way. or you can do the little hand raise thing, which I may or may not know. Hopefully do. But if you have any questions or comments, please interject, because this is not meant to be just the people in the room. I see them easier. So I'm going to stop right now and just see if anyone's got any questions or comments online that they want to throw out right at this moment.
Just one quick question from Peter. When I read verse 4 and 7 again, I'm counting 13 people in each, and I notice in verse 4 and 7 they're different. So I guess the Levites had their specialty maybe in interpreting the text.
It's hard to say what exactly happened there, because this is all we have, is this record. So there's speculation as to, like, why are the names different, and why is there 13 instead of 12, and things like that. But those are all speculations. So that didn't answer your question very well, Peter. In other words, we don't know.
That's okay. Honesty is the best answer, so that's good.
There's go. Any other questions from online? All right, I can see where this is going. And that is that we're only going to get through Nehemiah today. So next week we're going to start with the Last Supper text and stuff. But that's all right. So let me dig in just a little bit more here. So the communal ritual action, I want to talk about that for a minute. Affirm their identity as people in a covenantal relationship with God. So the first ritual action was when the scroll was brought in and lifted up. Okay, so that's, and you'll see this in some churches where the Bible or the lectionary is brought in and held up before the people, right? Usually in some sort of a procession. And you'll learn about this too when we get to the section on the Byzantine Empire. Anyway, so he lifts this up, and by doing so, what do you think he's saying? So he's got the scroll, Ezra's got the scroll, and he lifts it up. What is he saying? And he, by the way, is lifted up above the people on that platform. What is he saying by lifting up the scroll? What do you think that symbolizes? What does that say about the scroll?
It's very important.
This is more important than me. You know, I'm important in the sense that I have the responsibility of reading the scroll to you. That's why I'm up on this stage. And it was also so that people could see him. I mean, it was just a practical thing. But visually speaking, then when he lifts up the scroll, then he's saying this is the most important thing. And it was, and that's information people would get without him having to say a thing, right? They would just see it and go, yes, that's the important thing, right? This is why here, anyways, at Christ Lutheran, when we read the gospel versus the other two readings, we always read the gospel from the pulpit as a way of indicating this reading has the most primary importance. And the pulpit is raised up a little bit and everything. And so, I mean, that it elevates it in a sense, okay, in the same way, kind of elevates it in the same way. Plus, we usually mark the reading of the gospel with an acclamation beforehand. So there's this sung acclamation, usually that has the words Alleluia in it somewhere. Alleluia, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, Alleluia. That's one of the gospel acclamation. This is all a form of ritual action saying this is the important thing. So
we also stand.
And the congregation stand. Now notice in Nehemiah, they automatically stood up once the reading is about to be read. They just stood up. Okay. All right. Now there's a few more ritual actions. Sorry, was someone online saying something?
Yes, Val.
Yes, Val.
I just wanted to say, and when you're talking about that, I found it really interesting reading verse 9, where it says that the people, when they were getting this read to them, they all wept.
Yes.
I found that really interesting because in there he goes, don't mourn and weep, but go out and celebrate, is what he was saying. But I just found it interesting that they all were crying. Joy or happiness, or felt the feeling that they got from hearing those words must have been just really overwhelming, I guess, is where that came from.
Yeah, and there could be some tears of joy, but mostly it seems to be tears of regret and remorse. It's like, we didn't know these words. We have been wandering, in a sense, without these words for a long time, and we have not been true to the covenantal relationship. So I think it's and we know that, Val, because they do the covenant renewal a little bit later.
Right.
So that, but they have to be reminded that, no, hold it, this is a joyful thing. Yes, I mean, there's regrets that you've been missing these scriptures prior to this, but now you have them. So now you should be glad. So that's why they're told, no, don't mourn nor weep. So yeah, good point. Thanks, Val.
Yeah.
All right, so now we're not quite finished with all the ritual action. So you also have the raising of the hands, right? Like the people when the prayer is said, they raise their hands and say amen, amen, and this is kind of like the weeping too. Then they bow down with their faces to the ground. And what is that? That's a sign of submission to the authority of the scriptures now, because that's how you showed submission to an emperor, for example. Now, why would bowing down with your face on the ground, how does that show submission without saying anything about I submit to you? What are you doing by getting in that position? You're lowering yourself, but your face is on the ground. What else are you doing?
Well, you're kind of helpless.
You're helpless and vulnerable. If the emperor or whoever, right, wanted to come and strike you, chop off your head or anything, you have no way of defending yourself, right? So you are making yourself completely dependent on them in a sense, right? So this is these symbols, this kneeling and putting your face on the ground is symbolic of all kinds of things that in and of itself, without words, tells them stuff. It says the we submit to the scriptures to the importance of scriptures. We recognize their authority over us, over any other authority. Like there's some sort of recognition there, right? And we are humble, like in the presence of these most amazing scriptures. We recognize that we don't deserve this in a sense. There's a sense that we don't deserve them. And so all of those things are expressed through these ritual actions. And one of the things I'm going to try and help you understand through all the different things we go through in the next 4 weeks now coming up in 5 minutes, is the understanding that we learn not just through the words that are spoken and received through our hearing. We learn also through the actions that we do. So even in worship, we do certain actions that speak something or express something that has a meaning, and that meaning is also important in our faith formation. So let me try and wrap this up really quickly in terms of the Ezra Nehemiah stuff, because I didn't even get to the next two things too much. We get to I'll quickly touch on the Festival of Booths, the Sukkot festival. So this is prescribed in the Torah. So that's how they learned about it. They hear it, and there it is. It's in Leviticus. If anyone wants to look it up, Leviticus chapter 23, verses 42 and 43. That tells them that this is what they should do. They should celebrate this festival annually. So they built booths to ritually remember God's provision and protection during the wilderness wanderings. And obviously that festival had been totally forgotten by this point in time. So now they're renewing this annual festival. They're bringing it back into existence, right? So the ritual action of building, then living in simple structures made from branches, made the story of what God had done for their ancestors a part of their own lived experience. And this is one of the things that happens a lot. We see this in scripture a lot, and you'll see it with the Passover when we talk about that. There's a sense in which by doing these actions, I'm going to build this booth, we're going to live in it, we now become part of the story. It is now our story as well. So we're not just remembering something that happened to our ancestors in the past. We are now living that story for ourselves. And there's a way of connecting then history with personal identity. Kind of follow? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So then they do that, and so this festival helps shape their identity as people of God who provides and protects. And it helped celebrate God's provision by marking the end of the harvest. So it was a harvest festival as well. So it really was a festival of God provides for us what we need, whether we're in the wilderness or we're doing our harvest of the crop. Yeah, okay. Then the third thing is the covenant renewal ceremony. So you find this in chapter 9. So chapter 9, basically the whole chapter. So the people assembled for a third public reading of the Torah with a time of fasting and wearing sackcloth, signs of mourning and confession of sins. So they are, again, putting on a visual symbol of their mourning, of their sense that we have not followed through with what we're supposed to do, right? And then this is what happens. The Levites and Ezra offer a penitential prayer on behalf of the community, and that prayer recounts the history of the Jewish people, and that both acknowledges the people of Israel has not always heeded the Torah. In other words, yeah, like we haven't been heeding the Torah, but you know what? That's happened in the past too. So it's a way of reminding them you're not the only ones in this family story that have made this mistake. But there's also, as they recount this history, an expression of hope, as God is acknowledged as being compassionate and merciful in the recounting of this history. So as God was merciful to the Israelites in the past, the hope was that God would continue to be merciful and gracious in the present. So there's this public recitation of the history of Israel, and that serves to form their faith and their identity as the returned exiles by connecting their story with the story of God's covenant relationship with Abraham and Sarah and their descendants. So the penitential prayer in Nehemiah 9 aimed at shaping the identity of the Jews in post-exilic Judah. Okay, and so there was ritual action, there was words, there was discussion, conversation. I mean, these are all ways in which we see in Nehemiah that faith was formed, was passed on. So some of these people, like the children, for example, that are kind of inferred by saying, and all those who could understand, so meaning children old enough to understand what's being said, right? They would not know any of this. So how would they know to have faith in God? Well, they wouldn't know except through this recounting of the history, through the connection of this is our story as well, and so on and so forth. And in doing so, then faith is formed. But it's always done in this context, anyways, in community, whether it's the whole gathered people gathered in Jerusalem for these festivals, or for the public reading of the Torah, or back home as they would discuss with their neighbors what they had heard and how to live that out and develop this sort of synagogue approach to keeping their identity and their faith strong. So that brings us to 2 minutes after 11:30. So we are past our time, but I'll give one more chance for anyone to ask a final question or comment. Angela.
Are you gonna put this on YouTube?
Yes. Yeah. So all of these sessions will be loaded up to YouTube. I don't know how fast I'll be able to do that. Hopefully by the end of this week. I realize there's a lot of material coming at you. And that's because there was a lot of material that I went through. And I'm trying to give you as much as I can. So obviously the plan.
Pastor Dennis.
Yes, go ahead, Rose.
Sorry, this is Rose. I just have 2 questions. Would you be able to resend the questionnaire? And then the email that you sent with all the Bible verses that we needed to read for this one, that one got wiped out on my as well. So I don't know what the next Bible verses are. Like I knew about Nehemiah 8 and 9, but I don't know what the other ones were.
Okay, so this will be true for anyone. If there's anyone who needs something specific, like resending that email or whatever, please just email me. That's the easiest way for me to know to respond. Leona, do you have an email address?
I do, but my computer is.
Okay, so we won't count on that. Okay, so I won't worry about emailing you, but the rest of you feel free to email at any time. And I will also then express what we'll do next week. So next week we will do like the Last Supper stuff and the Acts 2 stuff, and then we will get into some of the other things too. And this is all, I didn't know how this was going to flow. I had to give them my lesson plan in advance. And I said, well, this makes sense. I'll do it this way. Well, anyways, this is how it is. So thank you for your attention. You sat in there for 2 hours. That was great. And I'll look forward to the future sessions with you. Let's end with a quick prayer. Gracious God, we give you thanks that through the scriptures, you teach us about relationship with you and one another. We give you thanks for the example of your people of Israel. And we look forward to the future sessions where we can continue to dig into these stories of your people throughout time and place. We ask your blessing on everyone gathered here and online as we move through our week. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, thank you, everyone. We got through the first one. Yay!